Nothing breathes in the ash wastes by choice. If you are out here beneath the choked, bruised skies of Ethalgard, you are either hiding from something terrible, or you are hunting something worse. Elias Thorne was doing a little bit of both. He adjusted the seal on his respirator, tasting the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. The wind howled across the desolate plains, kicking up abrasive clouds of gray silica that scoured the paint from his rusted hover skiff. He was a man made of sharp angles and weary eyes, wrapped in a heavy survival duster that had seen better decades. Once, he had been an exobiologist, mapping the engineered megafauna of this frontier world. Now, he was a scavenger, picking the bones of the very corporate machine that had ruined his career. Hovering near his right shoulder was Chips, a spherical AI drone with peeling yellow paint and a singular glowing blue optical sensor. "Warning," Chips announced, its synthesized voice perfectly flat and devoid of any urgency. "Ambient radiation levels are rising. Prolonged exposure will result in cellular degradation, followed by hair loss, organ failure, and a mathematically certain demise." "Appreciate the optimism, Chips," Elias muttered, steering the skiff over a jagged ridge of fused glass. "Just keep your sensors locked on that distress beacon." "The beacon is 50 meters ahead. I advise caution, and perhaps a lid-lined umbrella." Elias brought the skiff to a halt at the edge of a massive crater. At the center lay the shattered remains of a sleek, aerodynamic vessel. The hull was forged from a matte black alloy that absorbed the weak sunlight. Emblazoned on the twisted wing was the silver Ouroboros logo of Omnicorp, the monolithic conglomerate that owned Ethalgard and everything on it. This was not a standard freighter. It was a covert transport ship, and by the look of the impact trench, it had been shot down. Elias grabbed his plasma torch and slid down the ashen slope, his boots kicking up clouds of radioactive dust. The ship's hull was still dangerously hot. The entry ramp was warped shut, but a few minutes with the plasma torch turned the locking mechanism into glowing slag. He kicked the heavy door inward and stepped into the gloom. Emergency lights flickered in erratic crimson bursts. The air inside was freezing, a sharp contrast to the blistering wastes outside. He moved past the cockpit, ignoring the slumped forms of the corporate pilots in their sealed suits. He was not here for them. He was here for the cargo. In the center of the reinforced hold sat a massive, cylindrical stasis pod. It was entirely out of place, drawing power from an emergency backup generator that hummed with a deep, frantic vibration. Elias wiped a thick layer of frost from the reinforced glass observation port and peered inside. His breath caught in his throat. Suspended in a sea of translucent, supercooled amniotic gel was an egg. It was enormous, roughly the size of a ground car, covered in thick, overlapping scales that gleamed like polished obsidian. Even through the thick glass of the stasis pod, Elias could see a faint, rhythmic bioluminescent glow pulsating beneath the shell. It was a warm, fiery orange that shifted like liquid magma with every simulated heartbeat. "Analysis," Elias whispered, unable to tear his eyes away. Chips floated closer, casting a scanning beam over the pod. "Subject is a Class A biotitan ovum, colloquially designated as an apex dragon. Carbon dating and genetic markers suggest royal lineage. This is not a standard specimen. Elias, this is the offspring of a queen." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The dragons were the original apex predators of Ethalgard, genetically engineered beasts created during the planet's initial terraforming phase to clear the megaflora. They were supposed to be extinct, wiped out by Omnicorp decades ago when the iridium mining operations began. But a few survived in the deep caverns, growing larger, smarter, and incredibly hostile. "Omnicorp is smuggling a royal egg," Elias said, his mind racing through the terrifying implications. Why transport a weapon of mass destruction in a stealth ship across the dead zones? Perhaps they intend to make a very large omelet, Chip suggested unhelpfully. Before Elias could formulate a response, the deck beneath his boots trembled. A low, rhythmic thrumming echoed through the crater outside. It was not the wind. It was the sound of heavy repulsor engines. Proximity alert, Chip stated. 3 Omnicorp tactical dropships descending. Heavily armed combat personnel are deploying. I estimate we have 45 seconds before they breach the airlock and permanently revoke our breathing privileges. Elias cursed violently. He rushed to the stasis pod's control terminal. The interface was locked behind corporate encryption. Chips, interface with the pod. Override the magnetic locks and attach the anti-grav tethers. We are taking it with us. Elias, stealing property from Omnicorp mercenaries carries a mortality rate of 100%. My warranty does not cover this. Just do it, Elias snapped, unholstering the heavy mag pistol at his hip. Outside, the crunch of armored boots on the ash grew louder. The Omnicorp scrub team was moving in perfect, lethal synchronization. Through the jagged rent in the hull, Elias caught a glimpse of their commander. The man wore heavily modified combat armor, his face hidden behind a polarized visor, carrying a rotary plasma cannon like it weighed nothing. These were not standard security forces. These were cleaners, sent to erase mistakes. Pod is unsecured, Chips announced as the heavy cylinder detached from the floor with a heavy clank. Small repulsor nodes on the base of the pod flared to life, rendering the massive egg weightless. Grab the tow line, Elias ordered, hooking his end to his heavy-duty utility belt. We go out the side breach. They have established a perimeter. We are surrounded, calculating odds of survival. The numbers are extremely depressing. Forget the odds. Scan the ground beneath the dropships. What is the mineral composition? Chips paused for a fraction of a second. Primarily silica ash, layered over a dense vein of volatile pyroxene crystals. Highly unstable. Elias smiled. It was a grim, desperate expression. He knew the ash wastes better than any corporate soldier. Pyroxene was sensitive to sudden shifts in electromagnetic fields. If subjected to a massive spike, the crystals would collapse in on themselves, creating a localized vacuum. Perfect. Run a localized diagnostic on my mag pistol. Disable the safety limiters and overload the power cell. Turn it into a localized EMP grenade. Overloading the weapon will destroy it and potentially remove your dominant hand. Just prime it. Elias grabbed the heavy tow line of the floating stasis pod and hauled it toward the jagged breach in the hull. As he stepped into the glaring light of the ash wastes, red targeting lasers painted his chest. Hold your fire, the Omnicorp commander barked, his voice amplified by his helmet speakers. Secure the asset. Execute the scavenger. Elias did not hesitate. He threw the overloaded mag pistol directly into the thickest patch of gray ash beneath the central dropship. Cover your optics, Elias yelled to Chips. The pistol detonated. It was not an explosion of fire, but a blinding flash of pure electromagnetic energy. The blast hit the pyroxene vein buried beneath the crust. The reaction was instantaneous. The ground simply vanished. A massive, localized magnetic implosion tore through the crater. The sudden vacuum sucked the ash, the debris, and half the Omnicorp squad into a violently collapsing sinkhole. The central dropship lurched violently as the ground gave way beneath its landing struts, its repulsor engines screaming as it tilted into the collapsing earth. Chaos reigned. The remaining mercenaries fired wildly as the shockwave knocked them off their feet. Elias used the momentary destruction to his advantage. He hit the activation switch on his utility belt, dragging the floating stasis pod behind him as he sprinted for his hoverskiff. He vaulted into the pilot's seat, slapping the tow line onto the rear cargo hitch. He slammed the throttle forward. The rusted engines screamed in protest, but the skiff surged forward, banking hard over the lip of the crater just as plasma fire began to melt the ground where he had been standing a second before. He drove like a madman, weaving through the jagged glass monuments of the wastes, leaving the burning Omnicorp ships far behind. The massive stasis pod bobbed along behind the skiff, an ominous, glowing anchor. Structural integrity of the skiff is at 40%, Chips reported, hovering near the dashboard. We have successfully avoided immediate death. However, we are now in possession of Omnicorp's most highly classified asset. Elias glanced back at the heavy, dark egg. The pulse of the bioluminescence seemed faster now, agitated. Why steal an egg? Elias muttered to himself, the adrenaline slowly draining from his system, replaced by a cold, creeping certainty. Omnicorp did not do anything without a profit margin in mind. They were planning something monstrous. And somewhere out there in the deep dark of the planet, a creature of unimaginable power was waking up to a silent nest, preparing to bathe the world in fire to find what had been taken from her. Sector 4 was a subterranean labyrinth where sunlight was a myth and everything had a price. It was also the only place on Ethalgard where a man could reasonably hide a stolen royal biotitan egg. Elias navigated his battered hover skiff down the spiraling, kilometer-deep access shafts, leaving the radioactive storms of the surface far above. The air here grew thick with the smell of recycled ozone, synthetic street food, and damp desperation. Neon signs in a dozen languages flickered through the perpetual subterranean smog, casting garish reflections off the massive cargo tethered behind him. He had thrown a heavy thermal tarp over the stasis pod to conceal it, but the faint, rhythmic orange glow still pulsed through the thick canvas like a captive star. It was a beacon, and Elias knew his time was running out. I estimate a 74% chance we are violently assaulted within the next 3 minutes. Chips noted. Its singular blue optics swiveled to track a group of cybernetically enhanced thugs eyeing their heavy haul from a rusted catwalk. Should I prepare a highly offensive sequence of strobe lights to deter them? Just keep your transmission signature masked. Chips, Elias muttered, steering the skiff into a narrow, dripping alleyway flanked by humming power conduits. The last thing we need is an Omnicorp orbital satellite pinging your location. He pulled the skiff up to a heavy, rust-pitted blast door and hammered his fist against the reinforced metal in a specific, syncopated rhythm. A heavy mechanical lock disengaged with a deep thud, and the door hissed open. Inside was a makeshift laboratory bathed in the harsh, sterile glare of surgical lamps. The room was a chaotic sanctuary of servers, medical scanners, and disassembled tech. Standing over a workbench was Dr. Maya Lin. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, and a pair of magnifying goggles rested on her forehead. She was a woman who possessed an intellect sharp enough to cut diamond, and a stubborn moral compass that had ultimately cost her a highly lucrative career as Omnicorp's lead geneticist. Elias hauled the heavy repulsor lift pod inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He pulled the thermal tarp away. Maya froze. The color drained from her face as she stepped closer, her dark eyes reflecting the hypnotic, pulsing orange bioluminescence. She grabbed a handheld medical scanner from her desk and ran it over the thick glass of the stasis pod, reading the data scrolling across the small screen. "Elias," she said, her voice unusually tight. "Please tell me you did not steal what I think you stole." "Technically, it was salvage," Elias corrected. He leaned against a server rack, trying to project a casual confidence he did not feel. "Found a corporate stealth transport downed in the ash wastes. Mercenaries were trying to recover it. I figured anything they wanted that badly might fetch enough credits to buy us off this miserable rock." Maya turned to him, her expression shifting from shock to absolute terror. This is not black market salvage. Elias, this is a planetary death sentence. Look at the fractal energy patterns on the shell. Look at the immense thermal output. She pressed her hand against the glass, her fingers lingering over a cluster of scales that shimmered with an iridescent, almost metallic hue. This is not just a dragon. This is the royal lineage. This egg belongs to Aurelia. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Everyone on Ethalgard, from the wealthiest corporate executive to the lowest slum scavenger, knew the name, Aurelia. She was the apex queen. She was a legendary, terrifying force of nature, a creature said to be the size of a dreadnought, ruling the deep volcanic fissures of the Iridium Mountains with terrifying intelligence. The colony had an unspoken pact to leave her territory alone. Why would Omnicorp put a royal egg on a stealth transport? Elias asked, the grim reality of the situation settling over him. Let us find out, Maya said, her pragmatic, scientific nature taking over. She grabbed a thick bundle of fiber optic cables, expertly bypassing the pod's external access port and hardwiring the stasis unit directly into her own heavily encrypted mainframe. Her fingers flew across the holographic keyboard. Lines of Omnicorp proprietary code cascaded down her massive monitors, reflecting in her eyes. I am accessing the flight recorder data you stripped from the pod. Decrypting the manifest now. The screens flashed red, then settled into a display of a highly classified corporate document. At the bottom was a digital signature that made Elias clench his jaw. Governor Vance, Maya murmured, reading the text. The CEO himself authorized this Black Ops extraction. She opened an attached data packet, a three-dimensional holographic map of the planet's eastern hemisphere projected into the center of the room, highlighting the massive, jagged ranges of the Iridium Mountains. Red zones pulsed aggressively across the map. It is a manufactured crisis, Maya explained, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disgust. Vance is bleeding billions of credits because the expansion of the eastern mining operations is stalled. The deepest, purest iridium deposits on Ethalgard are located directly beneath the primary nesting grounds of the dragons. Elias crossed his arms. And he cannot legally carpet bomb an endangered species preserve, even if he practically owns the planet. The Interstellar Oversight Committee would strip his charter and throw him in a penal colony. Maya nodded fiercely. Exactly. He cannot act offensively, unless the dragons strike first, unless they become an immediate, undeniable threat to the human settlements. She pointed an accusing finger at the glowing egg. He stole her child. Governor Vance is going to use this egg as bait. He wants to drive Aurelia completely insane with grief and rage when she retaliates, when she flies out of the mountains and slaughters thousands of innocent colonists. Vance will declare a state of emergency. He will push the Eradication Act through the Planetary Council. He gets to wipe out the dragons legally, play the savior of humanity, and mine the iridium over their ashes. Elias stared at the massive egg. The rhythmic pulse felt entirely different to him now. It no longer looked like a valuable commodity or a terrifying weapon. It looked incredibly fragile. It was a life waiting to begin, entirely unaware that it was the linchpin in a billionaire's genocidal, profit-driven land grab. He looked back at Maya. She was watching him, her eyes searching his weathered face. There was a fiery, uncompromising determination in her gaze that he had always deeply admired. A stark contrast to his own hardened apathy. He realized in that quiet moment that he did not want to be just a cynical scavenger in her eyes anymore. We cannot let him do this. Elias, she said softly, stepping closer to him. The proximity was suddenly electric, a sharp awareness of the shared danger pulling them into a tight, intimate orbit. Elias let out a long, heavy breath, feeling the last remnants of his selfish survival instincts dissolving under the weight of her conviction. I am just a guy with a rusted skiff. Maya, you are an exiled scientist hiding in a basement. We are not an army. No, she replied, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, sending an unexpected jolt of warmth through him. But we are the only ones who know the truth, and we have the one thing Governor Vance needs to complete his massacre. Correction, Chips chimed in, floating directly between them and completely ruining the delicate tension in the room. We are the only ones who know the truth. We possess a highly explosive biological asset, and we are currently being hunted. My external sensors indicate a sudden and massive spike in encrypted corporate communications filtering through Sector 4's local network grid. Someone is actively scanning for the pod's unique energy signature. Elias stepped back, instantly grabbing his heavy mag pistol from the workbench and checking the power cell. Governor Vance was a ruthless tactician who planned for every contingency. If his elite scrub team in the ash wastes had failed to check in, he would not just send more standard mercenaries. He would send his personal hounds. The neon lights of the underground clinic flickered and dimmed, a sudden power drain signaling that the sector's perimeter alarms were already being bypassed by someone with top-tier access. The question was not if Omnicorp would find their hideout, but what fresh, high-tech nightmare Vance had unleashed into the underground slums to tear them apart. Fire rained from the bruised sky over the outer colonies, turning the titanium scaffolding of Outpost 7 into dripping molten slag. It was the apocalyptic wrath of a mother robbed of her future, and it was playing out entirely according to Governor Vance's grand design. Inside the subterranean gloom of Maya's laboratory, the holographic monitors had violently overridden their standard diagnostic readouts. The emergency broadcast system bathed the room in a sickly yellow warning light. Elias and Maya stood frozen, the pulsing orange glow of the stolen stasis pod casting long, shifting shadows behind them. On the screen, captured by a fleeing news drone, was Aurelia. The Dragon Queen was a creature of terrifying, majestic geometry. Her wingspan eclipsed the smog-choked sun, casting a shadow that swallowed entire habitation blocks. Her scales, thick as battleship armor, rippled with a bioluminescent fury, shifting from deep indigo to blinding white as she banked sharply over the mining facilities. She did not roar. Instead, she emitted a low-frequency seismic hum that shattered the camera's audio dampeners and vibrated the teeth in Elias's skull even through the broadcast. She unleashed a torrent of ionized blue plasma, vaporizing a row of heavy extraction vehicles in a heartbeat. The footage abruptly cut to the manicured, sterile office of Governor Vance. The CEO of Omnicorp looked somber, his hands folded neatly on his mahogany desk, a holographic projection of the burning colony floating beside him. "Citizens of Ethalgard," Vance intoned, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "Today, our greatest fears have materialized. The feral beasts of the Iridium Mountains have broken their containment. They have struck unprovoked at the heart of our industrious society. I am immediately declaring a planetary state of emergency and petitioning the Council for the swift, uncompromising authorization of the Eradication Act. We must secure our future. We must purge this threat." Maya slammed her fist onto her workbench, rattling a tray of surgical tools. The moral weight of the broadcast settled heavily over the room. Innocent miners and their families were burning because a billionaire wanted unchecked access to the dirt beneath a nursery. It was a profound, sickening lesson in the cost of corporate greed, reducing the majestic apex predators of a fragile ecosystem to mere political stepping stones. "He is orchestrating a massacre and playing the victim," Maya whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of rage and grief. He engineered this entire war. Elias watched her profile in the harsh monitor light. He had spent years telling himself that Ethalgard was a lost cause, a rock where morality went to die. But seeing the fire in Maya's eyes, the uncompromising empathy that Omnicorp had tried and failed to strip from her, something fundamental shifted inside him. He realized he could no longer hide behind his cynical armor. "We are going to stop him," Elias said, the certainty in his own voice surprising him. "I am mathematically obligated to point out that we currently lack the firepower, political capital, or general life expectancy to stop a planetary governor." Chips interjected, hovering directly into their line of sight. Furthermore, my perimeter sensors indicate that the highly encrypted communications spike has manifested into a physical reality. We have heavily armed visitors in the outer corridor. The power to the laboratory abruptly severed. The holographic monitors died, plunging the room into darkness, save for the rhythmic fiery pulse of the dragon egg and the weak red glow of the emergency backup lighting. "Not standard corporate security," Elias noted, drawing his heavy mag pistol. He checked the power cell by feel, sliding into a defensive crouch behind a bank of server racks. "Vance sent bounty hunters, professionals. They cut the main feed to blind your automated defenses. They do not know I built my defenses on a closed-loop pneumatic system," Maya replied, her fingers flying blindly across a manual override console hidden beneath her desk. The reinforced steel door of the clinic buckled inward with a violent kinetic shockwave, shearing from its heavy hinges and flattening a row of diagnostic beds. 3 figures stepped through the swirling dust. They wore sleek, light-bending stealth armor that made them look like walking voids in the dim light. The leader carried a specialized gravity whip, the coils humming with lethal, disruptive energy. Elias did not wait for a monologue. He leaned around the server rack and fired 3 rapid shots. The superheated slugs illuminated the room in bright blue flashes. The lead hunter deflected the first 2 rounds with a kinetic wrist shield, but the third caught his shoulder armor, spinning him backward. "Hostiles engaged," Chips announced, zipping toward the ceiling to avoid a barrage of returning needle fire. "Please try not to shoot the highly volatile, irreplaceable biotitan egg we are attempting to save." The hunters advanced rapidly, moving with terrifying augmented speed. One flanked to the right, raising a wide-beam sonic disruptor. Maya slammed her hand down on the red manual actuator. A pressurized pipe running along the ceiling above the flanking hunter violently ruptured. A concentrated blast of liquid nitrogen coolant sprayed downward, instantly freezing the hunter's weapons and armor joints. The man fell heavily to the floor, encased in a rapid layer of frost, completely immobilized. Elias provided covering fire as the lead hunter lashed out with his gravity whip. The glowing tether cracked through the air, wrapping around the server rack Elias was using for cover. With a flick of the hunter's wrist, the massive steel structure was ripped from its floor bolts and hurled across the room. Elias barely dove out of the way, rolling across the grated floor. "We cannot hold them here," Elias shouted over the deafening exchange of weapons fire. "There is an old smuggling hatch in the rear wall," Maya yelled back, triggering a localized flashbang from her ceiling projectors to temporarily blind the remaining attackers. "It leads down to the Maglev cargo depot. If we can get the egg onto an automated ore train, we can ride it straight into the dead zone of the Iridium Mountains." Elias vaulted over a shattered desk, grabbing the heavy tow line attached to the egg's repulsor pod. "Open it!" Maya pressed her palm against a biometric scanner concealed behind a loose wall panel. A section of the heavy stone wall groaned and slid sideways, revealing a dark, damp maintenance shaft. The lead hunter recovered from the flashbang, his helmet targeting optics locking onto the glowing pod. He raised a heavy plasma rifle, aiming squarely at the thick glass of the stasis unit. Elias threw himself into the line of fire, firing his mag pistol directly at the hunter's weapon. The round struck the plasma rifle's focusing barrel, causing a catastrophic misfire. The weapon violently overloaded, sending the hunter crashing into the far wall. Go! 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 Elias pushed Maya toward the dark passage, hauling the heavy floating pod behind them as they plunged into the cramped tunnel. They ran blindly through the dripping darkness, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. The tunnel sloped downward at a sharp angle, the air growing colder and smelling sharply of ozone and crushed rock. Ahead, the rhythmic metallic roar of a massive engine vibrated through the stone. They burst out of the tunnel onto a narrow, rusted metal platform. Below them, a colossal maglev cargo train was already in motion, its segmented, open-topped ore cars sliding past with building momentum. The train was a brutalist machine designed to haul thousands of tons of raw minerals through the treacherous magnetic storms of the dead zone. "It is leaving the station," Maya yelled, her voice barely audible over the roar of the magnetic rails. "We have to jump," Elias stated, wrapping the tow line securely around his armored forearm. He waited for a large, empty ore car to align with the platform. "Now!" He leaped, dragging the heavy hovering pod with him. He landed hard inside the rusted iron walls of the car, his boots slipping on loose gravel. He spun around, bracing his legs, and reached out his free hand. Maya jumped. The gap was wider than it looked. Her boots hit the slick outer rim of the moving car, and she began to slide backward toward the lethal high-voltage magnetic rails flashing below. Elias lunged, his fingers locking around her wrist in an iron grip. The momentum of the train jerked them both violently, but he held fast, pulling with all his strength. He hauled her over the edge, and they tumbled together onto the rough metal floor of the car. For a long moment, they lay there, gasping for breath as the train accelerated into the subterranean darkness, leaving the neon glow of Sector 4 behind. Elias realized his arms were wrapped tightly around Maya, protecting her from the harsh impact. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide, the rapid rise and fall of her chest mirroring his own. The adrenaline of the escape faded, leaving behind a profound electric silence between them. He did not pull away immediately, completely captivated by the fierce, brilliant woman who had just risked everything for a creature she had never met. "I have you," he breathed, his voice unusually soft. She held his gaze, a small, genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. "I know. While I am deeply fascinated by human courtship rituals involving near-death experiences," Chips interrupted, floating down from the sky above the open car, "I must report that our situation remains highly suboptimal." Elias reluctantly released Maya and sat up, rubbing his bruised shoulder. He glanced down at his heavy survival duster. Stuck to the heavy leather near his collar was a blinking, hexagonal micro-device, a tracker. The bounty hunter leader had managed to tag him during the chaotic melee in the lab. Elias cursed, crushing the tiny device between his thumb and forefinger and tossing the fragments over the side of the train. He knew it was too late. A ping had already been sent. Omnicorp knew exactly which train they were on. He turned his attention back to the massive stasis pod secured in the center of the car. The bioluminescent glow radiating from the heavy obsidian egg had changed. The warm, fiery orange had vanished. Instead, a deep, resonant, and entirely unnatural purple light now pulsed beneath the thick scales, casting an eerie, alien glow over the iron walls of the speeding train. Maya crawled closer, her brow furrowing in deep scientific confusion. She placed her hand against the cold glass. "Elias," she murmured, her voice laced with a sudden chilling uncertainty. "There is no record of a royal embryo emitting this wavelength. It is not just changing color. It is broadcasting." The dead zone of Ethalgard did not just kill machines, it swallowed the sky whole. replacing the bruised clouds with a churning ceiling of pure, lethal electromagnetism. The maglev train plunged headlong into the jagged maw of the Iridium Mountains, leaving the smog of the colonies behind. Here, the atmosphere was a chaotic canvas of violet aurorae and violent branching lightning that struck the black peaks with deafening concussions. The iron walls of the open-topped ore car hummed with a terrifying static charge, making the hair on Elias's arm stand on end. They were riding a metal bullet straight into the heart of a planetary storm. Hovering near the floor, Chips began to spin in erratic, jerky circles. Its singular blue optic flickered wildly from blue to static gray. My logic circuits are experiencing severe chromatic dissonance, the drone stated, its synthesized voice warbling off-pitch. I am currently calculating the digits of pi in reverse while simultaneously forgetting my own serial number. I strongly advise we invent teleportation. Before Elias could formulate a sarcastic reply, a massive bolt of purple lightning struck a towering spire of iridium rock just 50 meters from the tracks. The resulting electromagnetic pulse washed over the train like a physical wave. Chips immediately dropped to the floor of the car with a heavy metallic clatter, entirely powered down. More terrifyingly, the stasis pod went dark. The rhythmic, deep purple bioluminescence beneath the heavy obsidian scales vanished. The comforting hum of the pod's internal temperature regulators choked and died. A series of red warning runes flashed across the shattered digital display before the screen cracked under the sudden pressure differential. Maya dropped to her knees beside the heavy cylinder, her hands flying over the manual override valves. She wiped a sudden layer of condensation from the thick glass, her eyes wide with panic. The electromagnetic interference just fried the pod's internal battery. She yelled over the deafening roar of the wind and the screeching magnetic rails. The amniotic gel requires a constant thermal equilibrium. Without power, the ambient temperature of the storm will seep through the hull. The embryo will freeze solid in less than 10 minutes. Elias looked from the dark, heavy egg to the churning, violent sky above. Governor Vance had planned to use this creature as a pawn in a manufactured war. Letting it die here would ruin the billionaire's plot. But as Elias looked at Maya's desperate face, he knew that letting an innocent creature perish in the freezing dark was a line he would no longer cross. He scanned the length of the speeding train. 2 cars ahead sat the locomotive engine. It was a brutalist block of hardened steel, driven by a heavily shielded military-grade fusion core. It was the only clean power source within 100 miles. Keep the manual pressure stable, Elias ordered. He turned to the rear corner of the ore car, digging through a pile of salvaged mining equipment until he found a heavy spool of industrial plasma conduit. It was a thick, braided cable designed to jumpstart heavy excavation mechs, tipped with solid titanium prongs. "What are you doing?" Maya shouted, holding tightly to the side of the failing pod. "Going for a walk," Elias replied. He secured one end of the heavy conduit to the pod's emergency auxiliary port. He coiled the rest of the heavy cable over his shoulder and moved to the edge of the speeding car. The wind hit him like a solid wall of ice. He pulled himself up and over the rusted iron lip, his boots finding a precarious grip on the narrow, slick exterior coupling. Below him, the ground was a blur of lethal velocity, the magnetic rails glowing with a terrifying, raw, blue energy. He leaped across the gap to the next car, his heavy duster flapping wildly in the gale. The metal was freezing, biting through his gloves. He navigated the length of the second car, keeping his center of gravity low, dodging stray arcs of static electricity that danced across the iron rim. The storm above raged, throwing chaotic illumination over the alien landscape. He reached the gap between the final ore car and the massive locomotive engine. The engine housing was a different beast entirely. It was radiating immense blistering heat from the fusion core within. Elias jumped, Grabbing the heavy access ladder bolted to the side of the engine. The metal was searing hot. He climbed to the primary maintenance hatch, bracing his boots against the vibrating steel. He ripped the heavy access panel open. Inside, a tangled nightmare of high-voltage wiring and raw plasma feeds pulsed with blinding light. He needed to find the unshielded primary output terminal and jam the titanium prong of his conduit directly into it. He gripped the heavy cable, preparing to strike. As he thrust his arm forward, the train hit a sharp curve in the rails. Elias lost his footing. He slipped, his arm plunging entirely into the superheated maintenance bay. A stray arc of raw current lashed out, striking him directly on the forearm. The pain was absolute. It was a blinding, white-hot agony that seized every muscle in his chest and forced the air from his lungs. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let go of the heavy cable. The smell of burning leather and scorched flesh filled his nostrils, sickening and sharp. Through sheer, stubborn willpower, he forced his trembling, badly burned arm deeper into the housing, driving the heavy titanium prong directly into the primary output terminal. The connection sparked violently. Instantly, the thick conduit running back over his shoulder flared with surging power. Elias slumped against the side of the train, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His right arm was entirely numb, the sleeve of his heavy duster charred black and smoking. He had done it. He slowly pushed himself back to his feet, fighting a wave of intense nausea, and began the agonizing climb back across the moving train. When he finally tumbled over the lip of their ore car, he hit the rusted floor hard. The stasis pod was alive again. The deep, fiery orange bioluminescence had returned, bathing the dark car in a warm, pulsing light. Maya was beside him in a fraction of a second. She turned him over, her hands expertly and quickly evaluating his injuries. When she saw his arm, her breath caught. "You fool," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that cut right through the howling storm. She pulled a specialized medical kit from her belt, ripping away the charred remnants of his sleeve. The flesh beneath was blistered and raw. She applied a thick layer of synthetic biogel, wrapping the wound tightly with a compression bandage. Her hands, usually so steady during delicate genetic splicing, were shaking slightly. Elias watched her face in the warm, orange light of the pod. The cynical scavenger he had played for so long felt entirely foreign to him now. He had risked his life not for credits, and not for salvage, but because he believed in the woman kneeling beside him. "Just protecting our leverage against Omnicorp." Elias deflected, forcing a tight, unconvincing smirk. Maya stopped wrapping the bandage. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. She saw right through the hardened facade. In the cramped, freezing confines of the speeding train, surrounded by a lethal storm, the world outside simply ceased to exist. "You are a terrible liar, Elias Thorne," she said softly. She did not pull away. Instead, she reached up, her fingers gently tracing the soot-stained line of his jaw. It was a moment of profound shared vulnerability. They were two outcasts, entirely alone, carrying the weight of a world on their shoulders. Elias leaned into her touch, lifting his good hand to rest over hers. The bond between them, forged in the fires of an underground firefight and solidified in the freezing winds of the dead zone, deepened into something absolute and unbreakable. But the quiet intimacy was abruptly shattered. It did not begin with a sound. It began with a pressure behind the eyes, a sudden overwhelming shift in the very air of the ore car. The fiery orange light of the massive obsidian egg shifted instantly to a brilliant, blinding gold. Elias and Maya gasped simultaneously, dropping their hands. They fell back against the iron walls, clutching their temples. It was a telepathic resonance. A low-frequency mental wave washed over them, bypassing their ears and echoing directly inside their minds. They were suddenly flooded with a rush of alien emotion. It was not the predatory rage of a monster. It was the distinct, undeniable sensation of a child. They felt a profound, crushing terror of the dark, a deep confusion about the cold glass surrounding it, and a desperate, aching longing for a colossal, comforting warmth it had been stolen from. It was pure, unadulterated innocence. Maya had tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the psychic weight of the unborn creature's fear. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. This phenomenon shattered every piece of corporate propaganda Governor Vance had ever broadcast. The dragons were not feral beasts to be eradicated for profit. They were highly sentient, deeply emotional beings capable of complex thought and profound suffering. Vance was not just stealing an asset. He was torturing a child to provoke a genocide. The moral clarity of their mission was no longer just a rebellion against a corrupt corporation. It was a fight for the soul of the planet. As quickly as the golden light flared, it began to dim. The psychic connection faded, leaving them gasping for air in the cold wind. But as the egg's presence receded from their minds, another sensation took its place. The telepathic broadcast had been loud. Too loud. Elias felt a sudden, terrifying pressure pushing back from the jagged peaks ahead. It was a consciousness so vast, so ancient, and so consumed by apocalyptic grief that it made the mountain itself feel alive. The mother had heard them, and from the floor of the car, Chip suddenly rebooted with a shower of sparks, its blue optic glowing frantically. "Warning!" the drone announced, its voice a terrified screech. "My long-range sensors have recovered. I am detecting a massive barricade directly on the tracks 10 miles ahead. Governor Vance's mechanized infantry is waiting for us, and the bridge is out." A 10,000-ton cargo train does not stop gracefully, especially when the suspension bridge ahead of it has been turned into a cloud of vaporized atoms. Elias Thorne slammed his uninjured hand onto the emergency release lever of the ore car, his muscles straining against the rusted iron. The magnetic locks binding their car to the massive locomotive severed with a violent jolt. Ahead of them, the tracks simply ended over a gaping black abyss. A previous orbital strike, or perhaps the wrath of a very large, very angry mother, had completely obliterated the crossing. He braced for sudden and catastrophic deceleration, Chips announced, its blue optic spinning wildly. Elias grabbed Maya by the waist, pulling her down behind the heavy mass of the stasis pod as he triggered the manual repulsor brakes. The friction was immense, the air filled with the sharp, burning scent of melted iron and ozone as the separated ore car ground against the raw magnetic rails. Ahead of them, the locomotive engine and the front half of the train launched off the broken tracks, plummeting silently into the canyon before detonating in a blinding, subterranean sunburst of fusion energy. Their car slid to a shuddering halt mere inches from the jagged precipice. The heat from the explosion washed over them, pushing back the freezing chill of the dead zone for a brief, terrifying second. "We are walking from here," Elias stated, his voice raspy from the smoke. They scavenged a heavy-duty gravity sled from the train's emergency lockers. It was a flat, reinforced titanium pallet equipped with localized anti-grav thrusters, designed to move heavy machinery over broken ground. Elias and Maya manhandled the massive, pulsing obsidian egg out of the crippled stasis unit, relying on the pod's internal secondary battery to keep the embryo warm, and strapped it securely to the sled. The Iridium Mountains were not made of stone. They were a jagged, treacherous hellscape of fused black glass and razor-sharp crystalline outcroppings, forged by millions of years of volcanic pressure and orbital terraforming strikes. The sky above remained a churning ceiling of violet lightning, providing just enough chaotic illumination to see the lethal drops and narrow ravines. Elias took the front tow harness, the heavy straps digging into his good shoulder. Every step over the slick, glassy terrain was a calculated risk. His burned arm throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic pulse, but he focused his mind entirely on the physical labor, refusing to slow down. Maya pushed from behind, her boots slipping on the precarious inclines, her breath pluming in the freezing air. My optical sensors are detecting multiple thermal signatures sweeping the canyon network, Chips warned, hovering close to the ground to avoid the wind. Omnicorp hunter-killer drones. They are scanning for the biological heat signature of our very large, glowing cargo. Can you mask it? Maya asked, wiping a streak of ash from her forehead. I cannot rewrite the laws of thermodynamics. Doctor, Chips replied flatly. However, I can provide a highly sophisticated distraction. I am currently hacking into the local routing algorithm of the nearest drone patrol. I have altered their target priority parameters to classify the local wildlife as a higher threat than an unauthorized planetary extraction. A moment later, a sleek, heavily armed corporate drone drifted overhead, its red scanning laser cutting through the dark. It paused, swiveled its chassis, and abruptly accelerated toward a high ridge a mile away. Soon after, the distant night was filled with the erratic flashes of plasma fire and the terrifying, echoing shrieks of territorial razor wings, massive, bat-like predators that did not appreciate being interrupted during their nocturnal hunt. I have successfully weaponized the local fauna. Chips noted, You may applaud at your convenience. They pressed on, navigating the narrow, winding fissures of the mountain range. The sheer physical exhaustion forced them to take shelter beneath a massive, overhanging slab of black glass. Elias slumped against the cold wall, carefully unhooking the tow harness. He watched Maya kneel beside the gravity sled, checking the straps and brushing a layer of toxic silica dust from the thick, dark scales of the egg. The deep orange bioluminescence pulsed steadily, casting a warm, intimate glow over her tired features. They are not just animals, Elias, Maya said softly, her voice carrying a profound, quiet sorrow that echoed in the small cavern. The telepathic resonance we felt on the train proves everything my rogue research suggested. The initial terraforming teams did not just engineer beasts of burden to clear the megaflora. They created a sentient, self-aware species. They have a culture. They possess an emotional intelligence that rivals our own. Elias looked at the massive egg, remembering the crushing, innocent terror he had felt projecting directly into his mind. If they are sapient, then interstellar law strictly prohibits claiming their territory or exterminating them. It is a Class 1 war crime. Maya nodded, her dark eyes flashing with a righteous, uncompromising anger. Governor Vance knows exactly what they are. He buried the research decades ago. He deliberately classified them as feral pests to strip them of any legal protection. The corporate propaganda machine turned them into mindless monsters so humanity would not feel guilty about slaughtering them for the iridium buried under their homes. It is an atrocity built on a foundation of balance sheets. She reached out, her fingers resting lightly against the shell. This mother is not destroying the colonies out of mindless aggression. She is screaming for her child. She is trying to communicate her grief in the only language Omnicorp left her. Elias pushed himself off the wall, walking over to Maya. He knelt beside her, his uninjured hand covering hers against the warm shell. The cynical scavenger who had lived only for his next paycheck was entirely gone, burned away by the harsh realities of the past 24 hours. In his place was a man who had finally found something worth fighting for, and someone worth dying for. We are going to give her child back, Elias promised, his voice low and absolute. We are going to shatter Vance's entire empire. Maya turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with his. The connection was grounding, a fierce spark of humanity in the dark, alien cold. She offered him a small, exhausted smile, a silent acknowledgement of the unbreakable bond they had forged. "We need to move," she whispered. "The nesting grounds are just over the next ridge." They resumed their agonizing trek, hauling the heavy sled up the final steep incline of black glass. The storm above seemed to thicken, the violet lightning striking the peaks with increasing chaotic frequency. As they crested the ridge, the ground dropped away into a massive, naturally heated caldera. Steam vented from deep fissures in the earth, carrying the sharp scent of sulfur and ancient stone. This was the sanctuary. This was the undisputed territory of the Apex Queen. But it was no longer a sanctuary. Elias instantly threw himself flat against the slick rock, dragging Maya down beside him. The perimeter of the massive crater was lit up with blinding, high-intensity military floodlights. Governor Vance had not just set a barricade on the tracks. He had mobilized an entire mechanized army and marched them directly to the front door. Below them, ranks of Goliath-class siege walkers stood like iron titans, their heavy plasma cannons tracking across the empty sky. Companies of elite, heavily armored shock troopers patrolled the jagged rim, establishing overlapping fields of fire. In the center of the fortified line, a massive custom-built command mech painted in the matte black and silver of Omnicorp stood idle, surrounded by a phalanx of energy shields. Vance was already here. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, heavier than the gravity sled. The billionaire CEO had anticipated their every move. He knew they would try to return the egg to the nest, and he had simply waited for them to deliver the bait directly to his trap. "This is mathematically impossible," Chips whispered, hovering mere inches from the ground. "To mobilize a force of this magnitude across the dead zone requires logistical preparation that began weeks ago. He did not react to our theft. He planned it." Maya stared down at the blinding lights of the corporate army, her grip on Elias's arm tightening painfully. The entire narrative of the past 2 days clicked into place with horrifying clarity. But a darker, far more terrifying question immediately surfaced in Elias's mind as he scanned the heavily fortified caldera. Vance had brought an army to kill a god, and he was using them to hold the high ground. The trap was set. The bait was in their hands. Yet, as Elias looked deep into the massive, steaming fissures of the nesting grounds below, surrounded by thousands of heavily armed corporate soldiers, the sky remained entirely empty of giant wings. The Queen was missing. The silence of an empty battlefield is always a manufactured lie, especially when a corporate emperor has already paid for the slaughter. Elias recognized the quiet for what it truly was. The drawn breath of a predator waiting for the prey to step fully into the snare. He and Maya pushed the heavy gravity sled along the jagged upper rim of the caldera, staying low beneath the sweeping arcs of the military floodlights. The air was thick with sulfur and tension. Below them, Governor Vance's mechanized army stood in rigid, perfectly aligned formations, a brutalist monument to raw financial power. The goal was a deep, naturally shielded geothermal vent 50 yards ahead, a place where they could safely hide the glowing obsidian egg before Vance realized it had been returned to the nesting ground. They never made it. The jagged black glass outcroppings surrounding them abruptly shimmered, bending the violet light of the storm. 10 elite Omnicorp shock troopers deactivated their active camouflage cloaks, materializing in a tight, inescapable ring around Elias and Maya. They did not shout orders or offer a chance to surrender. They simply raised their sleek, magnetic acceleration rifles in perfect, lethal synchronization. Elias reacted with the pure, unthinking instinct of a man who had survived the ash wastes by anticipating the worst. He kicked the side of the gravity sled, spinning the heavy armored bulk of the stasis pod directly between Maya and the nearest line of rifles. Simultaneously, he drew his heavy mag pistol, but he did not aim at the heavily armored soldiers. He aimed at the ground beneath their feet. He fired 3 rapid superheated slugs into a highly pressurized sulfur vent hidden beneath a thin crust of black glass. The rock shattered instantly. A geyser of blinding, caustic white steam erupted 20 feet into the air, completely swallowing the right flank of the Omnicorp squad. The troopers staggered backward, their optical sensors temporarily blinded by the intense thermal bloom. "Chips, drop their communications," Elias roared, grabbing the tow harness and hauling the sled backward into the cover of a massive obsidian boulder. "Initiating aggressive signal jamming," the drone replied, zipping rapidly around the perimeter to project a localized dead zone. "I am currently flooding their tactical network with the complete, unabridged audio recordings of standard corporate tax code. It is highly disruptive." Maya did not waste a second. She unclipped a heavily modified datapad from her belt, sliding her back against the boulder as plasma fire began to chip away at their cover. She bypassed the standard encryption protocol she had helped design years ago. Diving straight into the local mesh network the troopers relied on for target synchronization. "I am overriding their heavy support," Maya shouted over the deafening crackle of weapons fire. Her fingers flew across the holographic interface. "Just keep them off me for 30 seconds. Elias leaned around the rock, firing precisely, forcing the advancing troopers to keep their heads down. The heavy slugs from his pistol sparked violently against their kinetic shields. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and running out of time. 2 troopers flanked the boulder, their rifles charging with a lethal blue glow. Before they could fire, the massive automated plasma turret mounted on a nearby ridge violently swiveled on its heavy gears. Maya had successfully hijacked its targeting matrix. The heavy cannon unleashed a torrent of suppressing fire directly into the Omnicorp ranks, forcing the elite soldiers to scatter and dive for cover. "Move the sled," Maya ordered, shoving her datapad back into her belt. They pushed the floating egg desperately toward the geothermal vent, the chaotic crossfire illuminating the canyon in strobes of blue and red. For a brief, agonizing moment, it looked like they might actually break through the perimeter. Then, the ground trembled with a rhythmic, mechanical earthquake. A colossal shadow fell over them, blocking out the violet lightning. A Goliath-class siege walker, towering 40 feet tall on reverse-articulated hydraulic legs, stepped directly into their path. Its massive, twin-linked rotary cannons spun up with a terrifying, deepening hum, locking squarely onto the gravity sled. The overwhelming heat radiating from the machine's power core pushed them backward. They were trapped. The remaining shock troopers regrouped, forming an impenetrable circle of interlocking energy shields around the walker. The chaotic skirmish ended as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by the cold, calculated precision of absolute corporate victory. The ranks of shielded soldiers parted smoothly. Striding through the gap was Governor Vance's personal command mech. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, plated in seamless black armor and silver trim, moving with an eerie, fluid grace that belied its massive weight. The machine halted 10 paces from where Elias and Maya stood cornered against the walker's legs. The armored cockpit hissed and folded backward, revealing Governor Vance standing confidently behind a reinforced energy barrier. He wore a tailored suit perfectly suited for a boardroom, entirely untouched by the ash and grit of the dead zone. He looked down at them with the mild, disappointed expression of an executive reviewing a deeply flawed quarterly report. "I must confess, Doctor." "Lynn," Vance projected through the mech's external speakers, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "When you vanished from your laboratory, I assumed you had perished in the slums. To find you here, playing the romantic rebel with a local scavenger is both deeply fascinating and entirely irrelevant. You are engineering a planetary genocide. Vance. Maya shot back, her voice shaking with rage, completely refusing to be intimidated by the titan of industry. You are deliberately torturing a sentient species to steal their land. The Interstellar Oversight Committee will see the data I have compiled. They will strip your charter and dismantle your empire. Vance offered a short, humorless smile. What data, Doctor? The data from a disgruntled, exiled employee and a documented criminal? By the time the committee receives any transmission, this entire mountain range will be a crater. He gestured expansively toward the massive siege walkers and the thousands of soldiers entrenched around the caldera. You see, you have fundamentally misunderstood the narrative, Doctor. The public does not care about the sentience of giant lizards. They care about their own survival. They care about the stability of their stock portfolios and the safety of their habitation domes. I did not bring an army here to hunt the Queen in the dark. I brought an army here to defend humanity from a feral, unprovoked attack. Vance's gaze shifted to the massive, glowing egg strapped to the sled. The deep orange bioluminescence cast a defiant reflection against his polished armor. The Queen is out there, tearing apart empty mining rigs, searching for her stolen prize. My telemetry indicates she is tracking its unique thermal signature right now. She is coming here. And when she arrives, she will not find an empty nest. She will find a heavily fortified human settlement. Vance leaned forward, his eyes turning cold and entirely dead. She will throw herself against my siege weapons. My cameras will broadcast her terrifying aggression live to the entire colony. And then, I will authorize the lethal force necessary to protect my brave soldiers. It is a perfect, legally sanctioned extermination, neatly wrapped in the guise of self-defense. Elias tightened his grip on his mag pistol, his mind racing for a way out, calculating distances and structural weaknesses. And what happens if she simply takes the egg and leaves? That, Vance replied softly, is a variable I cannot allow. The heavy rotary cannon on the arm of Vance's command mech smoothly swiveled, the targeting laser painting a solid red dot directly onto the thick obsidian glass of the stasis pod. Maya gasped, throwing herself in front of the sled. Elias instantly pulled her behind his own body, raising his weapon toward the towering mech, knowing entirely that his pistol would barely scratch its paint. You are loose ends, Vance declared, the mild boardroom tone vanishing, replaced by the ruthless finality of a dictator. And I abhor a messy ledger. Destroy the egg. Execute the scavengers. Vance's thumb hovered over the firing stud. The twin cannons on the Goliath walker behind them began to glow with superheated plasma. Death was a mathematical certainty, calculated in fractions of a second. Then, the air in the caldera vanished. It was not a physical vacuum, but a profound, suffocating drop in atmospheric pressure that popped Elias's ears and made the heavy mechs sway on their hydraulic suspensions. The violent, churning violet storm clouds above abruptly stopped moving. The chaotic lightning froze, and the howling wind died instantly, replaced by a silence so absolute and heavy it felt like the bottom of an ocean. A telepathic wave hit them. It was entirely different from the innocent, terrified broadcast of the unborn hatchling. This was a psychic concussive blast. It drove Elias and Maya to their knees, clutching their heads in agony. Several Omnicorp troopers simply collapsed, their nervous systems temporarily overloaded. It was an emotion so vast, so ancient, and so utterly consumed by apocalyptic fury that it threatened to crack the human skull just by proximity. It was the unfiltered, burning wrath of a mother who had finally found the monsters holding her child hostage. Governor Vance's targeting laser flickered and died as his mech's sensors were flooded with unprecedented electromagnetic interference. He looked up, his confident facade shattering. The solid ceiling of violet storm clouds directly above the caldera tore open in a perfect, massive circle. She did not fly down. She fell like a meteor of vengeance. Aurelia, the apex queen, broke through the atmosphere. She was a biotitan of unimaginable scale, her obsidian scales burning with re-entry heat, her massive wings tucked tight against her body. As she plummeted toward the center of the mechanized army, her jaws opened, revealing a blinding miniature star of ionized plasma building in her throat. The sky had finally answered the corporate emperor, and it was bringing hell with it. Gravity ceased to be a constant when the apex queen struck the earth. The impact was not a sound, but a profound geological event that instantly turned the solid black glass of the caldera into a surging liquid wave. Elias and Maya were thrown violently to the ground as the shock wave radiated outward, tossing Omnicorp's elite shock troopers into the air like weightless mannequins. The flawless, interlocking defensive formations of Governor Vance's army shattered in a fraction of a second. Aurelia did not pause to assess the tactical situation. She opened her massive horned jaws and unleashed the miniature star she had been incubating in her throat. A torrent of blinding, ionized blue plasma washed over the front line of Goliath-class siege walkers. The 40-foot-tall machines of war simply ceased to exist, their reinforced titanium armor flashing into vapor before the molten slag even hit the ground. The heat was apocalyptic, stripping the oxygen from the air and turning the rain into localized pockets of scalding steam. The probability of survival has officially dropped into the negative integers, Chip screamed, its internal cooling fans whining in desperation as it projected a series of false thermal blooms to confuse the automated targeting systems of the surviving mechs. Vance's army, trained for absolute obedience, recovered from the initial shock and returned fire. The sky above the caldera ignited into a chaotic lattice of lethal geometry. Heavy railguns, shoulder-mounted rocket pods, and synchronized plasma batteries focused entirely on the towering bioluminescent leviathan tearing through their center. "Push!" Elias roared, hauling himself off the shaking ground and grabbing the front harness of the gravity sled. Maya scrambled to her feet, throwing her entire body weight against the rear of the heavy stasis pod. The battle raging around them provided a terrifying, chaotic screen. They steered the floating egg away from the main engagement, aiming directly for the deepest thermal vent at the center of the nesting ground. They ran blindly through a nightmare of fire and shattered rock. A volley of armor-piercing missiles struck Aurelia's flank, exploding against her thick obsidian scales in a cascade of useless sparks. The queen barely registered the attack. She whipped her colossal iridescent indigo tail in a sweeping arc, shearing a heavily armored troop transport completely in half. The burning wreckage rained down around Elias and Maya. Elias grabbed Maya by the shoulder, dragging her behind the severed, sparking leg of a downed walker as a spray of shrapnel carved deep gouges into the black glass where they had just been standing. "We are almost there," Maya shouted over the deafening roar of the plasma breath and exploding munitions. She pointed to a massive, glowing fissure 30 yards away, a natural cradle of geothermal heat untouched by the corporate weapons. They broke from cover, pushing the sled with agonizing, desperate strength. The deep orange glow of the royal egg pulsed rapidly now, reacting to the terrifying proximity of its mother and the sheer violence of the surrounding environment. Suddenly, a heavy mechanical hum cut through the noise directly in front of them. Governor Vance's black and silver command mech stepped out from the swirling smoke, blocking their path to the sanctuary. The machine was battered, its energy shields flickering rapidly and its left armor plating deeply scorched by a near miss of plasma. But its primary weapons were fully charged. Vance was screaming over the open comms, his calm, calculated billionaire facade entirely broken by the sheer, unmanageable scale of the monster he had provoked. He looked past Elias and Maya, his external cameras locking onto the glowing obsidian egg. He knew his army was falling, He knew his planetary operation was crumbling by the second, but his ruthless corporate logic held fast to one final strategy. If the egg died, the Queen would never stop killing. She would wipe out the human settlements in a blind rage, and the Interstellar Oversight Committee would still have to authorize his Eradication Act. He could still win the war, even if he lost this battle. The heavy shoulder-mounted railgun on the command mech smoothly tracked downward. It was a weapon designed to punch through the hardened hulls of orbital cruisers, and it was aimed squarely at the glass of the stasis pod. Maya screamed, a sound of pure, helpless despair. Elias knew his modified mag pistol was entirely useless against heavy vehicle armor. He had no grenades, no sabotage equipment, and no time to push the heavy sled out of the targeting laser's path. He looked at the glowing egg, remembering the profound, innocent terror he had felt inside his own mind. He looked at Maya, the brilliant, uncompromising woman who had shown him that there was still something in this ruined galaxy worth sacrificing for. He did not hesitate. Elias spotted a heavy kinetic riot shield dropped by a dead shock trooper just a few feet away. He dove, scooping the heavy metallic slab off the ground, and vaulted directly onto the floating gravity sled. He planted his boots wide, raising the shield and positioning his own body squarely between the massive railgun and the obsidian egg. He locked the magnetic anchors of his boots to the titanium pallet, bracing himself for the end. "Elias, no!" Maya cried out, lunging toward the sled, but she was too late. Vance fired. The hyper-accelerated tungsten slug broke the sound barrier instantly, creating a localized vacuum as it crossed the short distance. It struck the center of the kinetic riot shield. The impact was entirely beyond human comprehension. The advanced kinetic barrier violently absorbed the immense energy, glowing white-hot like a captured star for a fraction of a millisecond before detonating outward in a catastrophic shower of fractured light, raw plasma, and twisted metal. The shield held just long enough to deflect the slug's trajectory, sending the heavy round tearing harmlessly into the canyon wall. But the residual kinetic force transferred directly into Elias. He was thrown backward off the sled with the force of a bomb blast. He crashed brutally against the jagged black glass of the caldera floor, tumbling lifelessly before coming to a complete stop. His heavy survival duster was in tatters. His ribs were shattered, and his vision instantly tunneled into darkness. A heavy, coppery taste filled his mouth. He could not draw breath. The stasis pod, however, remained completely untouched, the unborn creature safe behind the heavy glass. The deafening crack of the railgun firing cut sharply through the broader roar of the battlefield. Aurelia stopped. The massive queen ceased her fiery assault on the fleeing Goliath walkers. Her huge, horned head snapped toward the center of the caldera. Her golden eyes, each the size of a transport shuttle, locked instantly onto the scene at the thermal vent. She saw the broken human bleeding out on the sharp rocks. She saw the intact, glowing egg he had just traded his life to protect. And she saw the silver and black corporate machine raising its heavy weapon to fire a second shot. The telepathic frequency in the air shifted instantly. The raw, unfiltered apocalyptic rage vanished, replaced by a chilling, razor-focused, and utterly lethal executioner's intent. The mental pressure was so intense it forced the remaining Omnicorp troopers to drop their weapons and clutch their helmets. Aurelia completely ignored a fresh barrage of armor-piercing missiles striking her flank. She folded her massive wings tight against her body and lunged with terrifying biological speed. Vance frantically tried to pivot his rotary cannons, but his heavy machine was completely outmatched by the raw agility of the apex predator. Aurelia crossed the distance in a single earth-shattering leap. Her massive, heavy talons slammed directly into the chest plating of the command mech, pinning the multi-ton machine flat against the caldera floor with a sickening crunch of yielding titanium. Vance shrieked in absolute terror over the open comms. The queen did not use her plasma breath. She wanted this to be tactile. She bit down on the mech's primary weapon arm, her serrated teeth easily puncturing the heavy armor, and simply tore the massive railgun away with a violent jerk of her neck. She tossed the mangled weapon into the lava flows with surgical, terrifying precision. Aurelia used her front claws to rip the reinforced cockpit open, peeling back the thick blast doors like a tin can. She looked down at the cowering, wealthy CEO inside. She did not kill him. Instead, she expertly drove a single talon straight through the machine's primary fusion core and life support systems. The mech sparked violently and powered down, plunging Vance into absolute darkness, trapping the billionaire inside a powerless iron coffin, utterly defeated and exposed to the lethal elements of the dead zone. The surviving Omnicorp forces witnessed the absolute, effortless destruction of their invincible commander. Corporate morale, built entirely on paychecks and superior firepower, shattered instantly. The remaining shock troopers broke their defensive formations and fled blindly toward the canyon exits, abandoning their heavy equipment and wounded. The few functional Goliath walkers powered down their weapons and began a frantic, uncoordinated retreat into the ash wastes. The battle ended. The violent violet storm above finally began to break, parting slowly to reveal the cold, distant stars. The air in the caldera was thick with smoke, burning ozone, and the profound silence of a defeated army. Maya ignored the towering monster standing mere yards away. She crawled frantically across the jagged glass, her hands slick with blood, until she reached Elias. She collapsed beside him, pulling his head gently into her lap. His breathing was shallow and ragged, his skin pale beneath the soot. The ground trembled softly. Aurelia slowly turned her massive, armored form away from the ruined command mech. The mother lowered her head, her golden eyes fixed entirely on the two humans and the glowing egg. A battlefield baptized in plasma and corporate hubris leaves behind a silence heavier than any explosive payload. The war for Ethalgard was effectively over, but the final, terrifying verdict of the Apex Queen was yet to be delivered. Maya Lin knelt on the jagged, fused floor of the caldera, her hands pressed desperately against the ruined chest of Elias Thorne. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sharp, sulfuric scent of the geothermal vents. Around them, the burning wreckage of Governor Vance's mechanized army illuminated the swirling fog of the dead zone. Elias's breathing was a shallow, ragged sound, his face pale beneath layers of soot and ash. "Stay with me." "Elias," Maya whispered, her voice cracking as she applied the last of her synthetic biogel to his massive kinetic trauma. "You do not get to cash out now. You promised we would shatter an empire." "I am detecting massive internal hemorrhaging and a critically low heart rate," Chips announced, hovering near Elias's shoulder. The drone's blue optic was flickering, damaged by the raw electromagnetic fallout of the battle. "I possess an emergency cardiac stimulator, but it is calibrated for a heavy cargo grox. Applying it to a human might induce spontaneous combustion, or alternatively save his life. The odds are a fascinating coin toss." "Do it," Maya ordered, her eyes entirely focused on Elias. Before Chips could deploy the medical countermeasure, a massive, impossible shadow fell over them. Maya looked up. Aurelia, the apex biotitan, stood mere yards away. Up close, the queen was a walking mountain range of iridescent obsidian, her scales radiating an immense, localized heat that pushed back the freezing chill of the canyon. Her golden eyes, ancient and entirely alien, swept over the broken bodies of the Omnicorp troopers before locking onto the small, fragile humans huddled near the thermal vent. Maya instinctively threw her arms over Elias, positioning her own body as a futile shield against a creature that could vaporize a heavy cruiser. She refused to look away, meeting the terrifying gaze of the apex predator with an uncompromising, defiant glare. But Aurelia did not attack. She simply stopped, exhaling a long, low breath that smelled of ozone and deep earth. Her attention shifted from Maya to the massive, glowing stasis pod resting on the heavily damaged gravity sled. The thick, reinforced glass of the cylinder, already spider-webbed with micro-fractures from the extreme temperature fluctuations of the dead zone and the concussive shockwaves of the siege, finally gave way. It shattered inward with a sharp, crystalline ring, spilling the translucent amniotic gel across the black rocks. Inside, the massive obsidian egg began to tremble. A deep, resonant, and entirely organic hum vibrated through the air, completely different from the chaotic mechanical roar of the corporate weapons. A jagged crack appeared at the crown of the shell, glowing with an intense, fiery gold light. With a wet, heavy crunch, the shell broke apart. A creature the size of an industrial transport rover pushed its way out of the ruined casing. It was an apex hatchling, slick with fluid. Its juvenile scales a soft, mottled gray that rapidly began to harden and shift into a deep, bioluminescent indigo as they reacted to the oxygen. The hatchling shook its head, letting out a sharp, bird-like trill, and opened eyes that burned like twin miniature suns. It did not look at the towering mother above it. It looked directly at the ground. It looked at the blood smeared across the black glass. And it looked at the broken man who had thrown away his own life to act as a shield against a hyper-accelerated tungsten slug. The hatchling took a clumsy, uneven step forward on its heavy, taloned legs. Maya tensed, preparing to fight the newborn beast with her bare hands if necessary. But the creature ignored her entirely. It lowered its heavy, horned head, stepping carefully over the ruined kinetic riot shield, and approached Elias. It let out a soft, inquiring warble. The hatchling pressed its broad, warm snout gently against Elias's uninjured hand. A sudden, overwhelming golden telepathic wave washed over the caldera. It hit Maya instantly. It was not a projection of fear or apocalyptic rage. It was a profound, radiant projection of absolute gratitude. It was a recognition of sacrifice, pure and unfiltered, broadcasting the emotional intelligence of a highly advanced, sapient soul. Aurelia watched her child. The massive mother let out a low, rumbling frequency that vibrated the very marrow in Maya's bones. Then, the impossible happened. The towering biotitan, a creature of terrifying mythology and unparalleled destructive power, deliberately folded her massive armored wings. She stepped forward, her heavy footfalls shaking the earth, and slowly lowered her colossal horned head. She brought her snout down to the level of the broken black glass, her immense golden eyes resting on Elias Thorne. Aurelia closed her eyes and bowed. It was a deliberate, unmistakable gesture of cross-species respect. The Apex Queen was acknowledging the human who had saved her bloodline. In that single breathtaking motion, the entire foundation of Omnicorp's vicious propaganda shattered into dust. These were not feral monsters to be eradicated for corporate profit. They were a proud, intelligent civilization, capable of profound empathy, understanding the universal language of sacrifice. The hatchling nuzzled Elias one last time before turning and bounding awkwardly toward its mother. Aurelia nudged her offspring gently with her massive snout, entirely ignoring the ruined command mech and the fleeing corporate soldiers. Without another glance at the humans, the queen spread her colossal wings. With a single, earth-shattering downward thrust, she launched herself into the breaking violet storm, carrying her child away into the deep sanctuary of the Iridium Mountains. Maya let out a ragged breath she did not realize she was holding. She looked down at Elias. The golden telepathic wave had not just been an emotional broadcast. The close proximity resonance had actively stimulated Elias's failing nervous system. acting as a massive biological adrenaline spike. His chest heaved, and he drew a sharp, agonizing breath, his eyes fluttering open to the chaotic starlit sky. "I feel," Elias rasped, coughing weakly, "like I was run over by a cargo train." Maya let out a choked laugh, wiping away a tear that cut through the ash on her face. She leaned down and kissed his soot-stained forehead. "You did beautifully, Elias. You saved them." "Correction," Chip stated, hovering closer with its damaged optics sparking. "We survived a mathematically impossible scenario. However, I must remind you that the vacuum of power created by the absolute destruction of a corporate governor will invariably attract new, highly ambitious interstellar entities to Ethalgard. Our employment prospects remain dangerously complicated." The drone was entirely right. The War of the Caldera was over, but the political shockwave was just beginning. While Elias was fighting to keep the egg safe, Maya's heavily encrypted datapad had been quietly working in the background. The moment the intense electromagnetic interference of the storm broke, her bypass program executed its final command: the unedited footage of Governor Vance's confession, the irrefutable telemetry data of the telepathic resonance, and the live-streamed unprovoked corporate attack on a highly sentient species were blasted across the local mesh network and fired directly to the Interstellar Oversight Committee relays. The fallout was catastrophic and instantaneous. Weeks later, the sky above the colony of Ethalgard was no longer choked with the gray smog of unregulated iridium refineries. The sprawling corporate towers of Sector 1 were dark, seized by federal marshals. Governor Vance had been extracted from his powerless iron coffin in the dead zone not by a rescue team, but by heavily armed federal investigators. He was currently awaiting trial in a maximum security orbital detention facility, facing a lifetime sentence for manufacturing a planetary war, ecological terrorism, and crimes against a sentient species. Omnicorp's planetary charter was revoked with extreme prejudice. The monolithic conglomerate was aggressively dismantled, its assets frozen to pay reparations to the families of the outer colonies who had suffered due to Vance's manufactured crisis. More importantly, the Interstellar Oversight Committee officially vetoed the Eradication Act. Ethalgard was reclassified. The Iridium Mountains were designated as a Level 1 sentient sanctuary, strictly off-limits to any mining or corporate exploitation. Elias Thorne stood on a high, reinforced balcony overlooking the distant, jagged peaks of the Eastern Hemisphere. He leaned heavily against the railing, his right arm supported by a sleek, advanced synthetic brace. The ash wastes below were changing. Federal terraforming ships were slowly seeding the irradiated plains with resilient, bioengineered flora, painting thin, hopeful streaks of green across the endless gray. Maya stepped onto the balcony, handing him a steaming mug of synthetic chicory. She wore a tailored civilian jacket, her days of hiding in a damp, underground laboratory officially behind her. She had been appointed as the lead liaison for the newly formed Interstellar Ecological Board, tasked with studying and protecting the very creatures she had helped save. "The atmospheric scrubbers in Sector 4 are finally online," Maya said, leaning against the railing beside him. "The slum is actually seeing sunlight for the first time in a decade." "It is a good look for the planet," Elias replied, taking a slow sip from the mug. He looked at her, his cynical armor permanently discarded, replaced by a quiet, genuine peace. "You did all of this, Dr. Lin. You changed the world." "We changed it," Maya corrected, her dark eyes reflecting the distant clearing sky. She reached out, her hand resting comfortably over his uninjured arm. "You showed them that humanity is more than just a balance sheet and a plasma rifle." They stood together in the quiet morning air, looking out over a recovering world. They had forged an uneasy but hopeful peace between a greedy, expanding human civilization and the ancient, intelligent titans that shared their home. It was a profound lesson etched in fire and obsidian. Life, in all its alien, terrifying, and beautiful forms, holds a fundamental, undeniable right to exist. True courage is never found in the willingness to pull a trigger, but in the absolute, uncompromising choice to drop a shield and protect the innocent, no matter the cost. The dragons were safe, sleeping deep within the heated caverns of the mountain range. But the galaxy was vast, and human ambition was a persistent, dangerous thing. Elias and Maya knew their fight was not truly over. It had simply evolved. They would stand as the guardians of the border, watching the skies, ready to remind the universe that on the colony of Ethalgard, the monsters were not the ones with wings. Thank you for watching this journey across the ash wastes. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with your fellow sci-fi fans. Leave the word hatchling in the comments below to let me know you made it to the very end. And do not forget to hit the hype button so this video reaches more viewers like you who crave original, mature storytelling. Until the next adventure, keep looking up at the stars.